Good morning, everyone. Nope. I worked in Chicago public schools for some time, and I am an expert at herding cats. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. I want to just say thank you so much to the IICF Forum Committee for choosing to consider the message that I try to consistently bring to any audience I speak with. My name is Xavier Ramey. I have the honor to serve as the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Justice Informed. As was said, we are a social impact consulting firm. Our vision is not to have 1,000 clients. Our vision is to have 10 good examples of what business should have been in the first place. Our desire is to not look at changing hearts and minds. Our desire is to understand that it's within the context of how we create businesses that we find the permissions for inequity. It is in the ways in which we envision the founding documents, both of our country and our companies, that we find the need to make reforms later on. For example, we have in America, we founded this country in 1776, and it wasn't until 1964 that we actually achieved civil rights acts. And we have to ask ourselves, if we had to change it, why didn't we do it first from the beginning? This is the reality of the opportunity that we face when it comes not only to our country, but to our companies. Our companies operate out of a framework, out of an idea of what business should be. All of you all are working for insurance companies that may have little small operations here in the Chicagoland area. I know many of you are working for companies that reach coast to coast across America, and quite a few of you are also at global companies. And the reality is all of us have one thing in mind when we're talking about what's the purpose of a company. Keep enough money coming in to pay your people. Keep enough money coming in to keep people happy. Keep enough money coming in to make sure that folks know that this is a good place to work. Keep enough money coming in. What we don't often look at is the effect of how we make our money and the ways in which the practices of business often can undermine the reality of charitable investments. It can undermine the reality of investments in diversity, equity, inclusion. It's in the how, not the what. The how we consider and make impact, and how we consider driving profit, and how we consider building pipelines, that we find the challenges. And the reason why I think, this is an I statement, I know everyone here may not agree, the reason why I think we're stuck in some of the data points that we've talked about today, from looking at just 0.23% of insurance companies' total spend being on diversity, equity, inclusion, versus the reality of the value proposition that many have on their websites, is that we're not really bought in. We're not bought into what the outcome might be. McKinsey put out the business case for diversity. It was a seminal white paper in 2014. I'm sure many of you all have heard that phrase, the business case for diversity. Show of hands, you heard that? Right? There's a social case that matters to people who are diverse. There's a justice case that matters for people who are diverse. There's a humanity case for people who are diverse. There's more than just the money to make the difference. And I know we're gathered here because all of you believe in the power of charity. You believe in the power of giving back. And what I want to talk to you all today about, and I hope that through the rest of this day, you all consider, is the power, yes, of giving back, and also the power of not taking first. Dr. King once said, it is commendable to engage in the work of philanthropy, but it cannot confuse the philanthropist to not understand the underlying causes that created the need for philanthropy. And so today I want to talk to you all about root causes. I want you to say this with me. Activities are not strategies. Strategies are not impact. Activities are not strategies. And strategies are not impact. We're here for impact, not activities. What we're often confusing is the difference. When we're counting volunteer hours, those are inputs. Those are inputs. We hope that by volunteering, we're creating a change. But the reality is the ultimate impact is changing our society and our communities in such a way that we don't need to be volunteering. So that's impact. Volunteering is an input. The ability to remove the need for it, well, that's impact. I grew up in the North Lawndale community in the city of Chicago. North Lawndale is a neighborhood is predominantly black on the west side of our city. It is the best side of our city, and it's the only one that rhymes with best. We have that market share. And I grew up on the west side of Chicago. I have a background in economics. I started actually as a commodities trader at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. It's strange that I'm running a company called Justice Informed now. But the reality is the experiences that I had in the financial services industry were in many ways what led me into my work today. When you go into financial services, and this is before the Great Recession, and this is when in the Eurodollar pits, people were still over there, 5 half on 20 and 2 half on 10. And, there's the open outcry side of it. And I go down there and everyone was like, man, you're going to do great in this industry. Why did they say that? Because I was tall. I'm 6'5". And they were like, everybody's going to see your orders. You put your hands up, everybody's going to know you're selling. They're going to know when you're buying. And there would be some guys there, they'd have the lifts. They'd have platform shoes on. They'd be down there looking at me with scowls. And I was like, favor ain't fair. But it is what it is. Privilege, right? Privilege. I have privilege. And so I'm down there in the pits. And here's the challenge. I'm the black guy. I'm not down there as a clerk or an intern learning the trades. I'm not just looking at the boards, understanding pricing theory. I'm not in the back understanding economic theories and trying to understand how to use the Black-Scholes model to price futures. Right? I'm not doing all that. I'm the black guy. I was having a very black experience in the pits, a very black experience. And what that means is, though my employer, I'm sure, wanted me to have a very employee experience. They wanted me to have a very financial services experience. They wanted me to have a you're good at math experience. But the reality was I was having a black experience. What that meant was the first thing they saw, of course, was the body. The second thing that they considered was that I was going to come in and start talking about black stuff. And every time I talked about what it meant to be black, it turned into this strange conversation of why are we talking about race? This is the challenge of homogeneity. This is the challenge of homogeneity. When everybody's the same in the room, they don't know they're the same. Does a fish know it's swimming in water? Or does it only know it when it reaches into the air and it lacks water? Culture is created through homogeneity. And in that, we find our bias. In that, we find our blind spot. And many of the people I was working with couldn't understand why a person who had the resume, had the will, was showing up 6 a.m. every day, working until 5 p.m. every day, and then signing up for 2 or 3 hours of classwork afterwards to learn how to really learn this trade, putting in the time, wasn't happy. This is before the word microaggression existed. Some of you all may remember that. When it was simply, you're being sensitive. You're too sensitive. You're taking everything personally, Xavier. There was no phrasing for the types of things that the generation today is able to speak about, and heads will nod and say, yes, microaggressions. It was complaining back then. It was a lack of fitness back then. It was not understanding the culture back then. It was these sorts of things that were the formative experience in the workplace. And unfortunately, as someone who does a lot of assessments and audits for organizations and companies around the US, I know that hasn't changed. When we're reading survey data from DEI surveys, we see people say, I think just people are just too sensitive here. I think this is a culture of complaining. I think that folks are always making it about race. I think that people are always making it about gender. And the reality is if we would step back and say, what experience do we want people to have if we assume that everyone's different and unique and they may not be having the same experience I'm having? The purpose and responsibility of leaders today in business is not to try to create a workplace just for humans. It's to respect that we are all very, very different and having very different experiences. The 9 to 5 is important, but it's the 5 to 9 that shapes the context. It's what shapes the reality and the readiness to come in the morning. What George Floyd taught us, or what 2020 taught many companies, was that what was happening to some of their black and brown employees when they went back into their communities was materially affecting the way they were able to come in and be productive for work. And the companies couldn't just agnostically say you're an employee, you are part of our labor pool. They had to say you're a person. And when you go out into society, you're someone I would like to call neighbor, but I don't live anywhere near you. We realize that there are many people and companies that are demanding diversity, equity, inclusion to be a part of the work of their corporations, but then they get paid and they go segregate the city themselves. We go back to our segregation. We choose that. And in that, what's the challenge? We know that when we're more proximate, when we're together, when we're talking together, when we're walking together, when we're living together, we learn those little things about each other. We grow comfort and ease with one another. We take away the blind spots, and we don't get offended when people call us out because we know that they're just calling us into community. That's what happens when you're close. And that's what many people are pushing away. Those experiences. And then the modern workplace is now becoming ground zero for learning about diversity. And we come into these spaces, we come from our seclusion, our isolation, and our segregation, and then we say we need to learn how to be together when we're getting paid. That is a recipe for disaster. That is a recipe for disaster. If we're going to read White Fragility, we're going to read it on the clock. If we're going to watch the movie Origin, we're going to watch it because it's a part of a professional development experience. It's not a life development experience. It's a professional development experience because diversity is about work and workplaces, right? But it's our society. It's our society that is not preparing us for what we are demanding in the workplace. But if we look at our society and our solutions for that, the main apparatus is twofold. It's volunteering and charity. We give back, but we don't count how we take first. We move into and volunteer in places we would never live. We insist on ensuring that young people have tutors, but we don't vote for them to have better schools. We love to show up and talk about preparing beds and bags and book bags and supplies for people experiencing homelessness, but we're not going to vote for affordable housing where we live. You see what I'm saying? How do we fix this? How does this turn into a better society? And then we put all of the work, the responsibility on the back of American businesses to say, now fix this. And I'll show up on the clock when I'm getting paid to learn more about it. That is a recipe for disaster. There's got to be something better. Instead of measuring impact, we're going to measure the inputs and the activities. We're existing now in a world, let's talk more about the headwinds. Over the last several months, when we talk about equity, we talk about diversity and inclusion, not just in the workplace. We're existing right now in a country that's saying we're trying to make it illegal to even learn about the nature of what created the situation that is an opportunity for us to be impactful. We're outlawing the idea of even learning about it. Just several months ago, several white complainants went to the Supreme Court in Texas and said that the minority supplier diversity program of the federal government was unconstitutional. And they won. They won. The Supreme Court agreed with them because on the basis of the Constitution, it says everybody's equal in America. Did you know that equality is an outcome? It's an outcome. It's not a strategy. Equality is an outcome of doing the work of making the world more equal. Equity is the strategy. But when we talk about equity and we talk about measurements and we talk about diversity and we talk about bringing people in, increasingly we're talking about not measuring anything. You all work in businesses, so you all have likely heard this phrase, what gets measured gets done. I heard some of y'all mouthing it before I even said it. What gets measured gets done. And when we're in there advising ERGs, when we're in there advising business resource groups and DEI council leaders, we're dealing with questions like, I think we're going to be in trouble with our compliance and our regulations if we start measuring diversity. I think that if we have a goal for increasing women in the C-suite, we may get flagged from the EEOC. I think if we write down our goals for impact, we may be put at the crossroads for litigation. And there's this fear now about measurements. There's a fear about measuring things, about having a goal. How many of you all can walk into a meeting with your supervisor, with your CEO, with your head of business development and say, I'd like to talk about some activities and I don't want to talk about goals? How many of you all can walk in and say, I'm looking for a budget, but I'm not looking to tell you what the impact's going to be? You can't do it. How many of you all, because I know everyone here has probably tried to sell something. You tried to sell an idea, you tried to sell some insurance. How many of you all could actually go into a meeting And you're talking about the KPIs for this quarter and say how many sales were driven by your team or by the business development team. Let's say the goal was $5 million for a quarter for a small team. Say, we want to sell $5 million worth of insurance. And you come in and you say, we got 250,000. We sold 250,000. And you walk into that leader and they ask you a natural question. What happened to 5 million? And you say, we talked to a couple people. It was really uncomfortable. So we left. Yeah, it was Brad was uncomfortable. Susan was uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable. It was a little tough. They didn't understand what we were talking about. We tried to tell them, but it was a little tough, so we left. 0.023% of total spend in DEI, because it gets uncomfortable. And that somehow is okay. Our relationships to one another is what we're fighting for. And honesty about our history is what we're fighting for. Authenticity and integrity is what we're fighting for. What gets uncomfortable is the mirror. The mirror is hard to look into. One of the things that I do a lot of executive coaching and leadership advisory services, and I always tell our clients, I'm like, look, my job is to keep you in front of the mirror and away from the window. Don't look out at the world. Don't ask me about best practices. There are very few best practices for work people rarely do. Ask me about next practices, new practices. Ask me about how you want to lead in your sector. Don't ask me about how you want to follow. Every person here who's ever worked with or engaged with an innovation team knows that best practices are the death of innovation. It requires you to always look at what's always being done. And what happens in a competitive marketplace when you're already doing what everyone's doing? You get lapped. Someone gets an edge. Someone gets the win over you, but we don't think about it that way. When it comes to people and relationships and equity and equality, we don't think about it for some reason. That way we say, no, this thing here is different. This thing we have to manage differently. This thing we shouldn't have measurements. We shouldn't have goals. We shouldn't look for impact. We should look for activities. We should look for spend. We should think about discomfort. We shouldn't think about resiliency. We should talk about how people feel called in. We shouldn't be talking about what we're against. We need to just talk about what we're for. We need to be very, very clear about how important it is to be about something, but we can't be specific about what created the need to be about it. How do we make progress when these are the terms? How? It's impossible. It's impossible to make traction. You see where I'm going, y'all? How do you feel right now? How do you feel? I see some serious faces. Breathe. Take a breath, everyone. Take a breath, seriously, take a breath. This is what it means to be in what I often call the press. To be in a container of energy and to be formed and molded, being face to face with the mirror long enough that you can look at it and love what you see. That's what we need to do. We need to look in the corporate mirror. We need to look in America's historical mirror. We need to look in our individual mirror long enough and be honest about what we see and not be ashamed about what we see. Honesty doesn't have to come with shame. Shame is when you make yourself the sole determining variable in the outcome. You are not responsible for transforming society. You are responsible for transforming yourself so much that society sees that it needs to do some work. Your job is not to raise so much money that you change the world. Your job is to understand how much money you have that you need to give away until it changes who you are. The work starts inside. It starts inside first. I've learned this with DEI. I've been in social impact for the last 20 years. The problem isn't even strategy. The problem isn't even strategy. No one believes the strategy. You know what they believe? A testimony. Did it work for you? Then I'll have hope. Did it work for you? Did you try that? If you didn't, what can they believe? What can they stand on? And what's the variable that gets you to try something? Courage. No one can pay you to be courageous. None of those dollars that we looked at this morning, none of those data points on spend have anything to do with courage. The courage to do what's right because we know it's right. The courage to be different because being the same is harmful. The courage to move forward because backwards is nowhere we need to be. The courage to say the truth because that's the only thing you should say, and pay the price for the truth because a lie is never worth the value. Courage. Courage to move forward. Courage to say we're about charity and we're also about advocacy. We want to work ourselves out of an organization. We want to hold ourselves responsible and accountable to changing the conditions of the communities, not just the circumstances of a few individuals. We want to look at the macroscopic issues when we're talking about workforce development and training programs and job creation and these sorts of things. We want to not just look at, did we get people jobs, but are they getting living wage jobs? We want to look at the fact that a lot of young people, when we look at the United States of America, we have an incredibly high illiteracy rate, and we need more people tutoring young people. We need more folks focused on finance. We need more folks focused on ensuring that young people are prepared to be the employees of the future. And at the same time in the workplace, what's happening? Everybody's working even more. Who here feels sufficiently rested? Who here is like, PTO? No one needs. Why? Why? I don't prefer time off. I'm time on all day. Coffee? Who needs it? I've had 2 cups. One of them was straight espresso today. Okay? We're tired. We're tired, y'all. We're tired. And I'm black. I'm tired. Okay, like this is real, y'all. We're tired and there's work to do. How does that add up? We would have to change the way that we do and engage the pace of business to be more equitable. What good are you in a world that needs your energy and your ideas when you're showing up with your exhaustion and your need for learning? You're going to need to get some rest and some help. Equity needs to benefit you too. Dr. King has this quote. He says, "We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality." We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Do you believe that? Do you believe that what's happening in the Sudan right now is connected to you? It's a fair question. Do you believe that what's happening right now at the southern border in Texas is connected to you? Do you believe that what's happening right now with anti-DEI legislation in Florida is connected to you? Do you believe that the lawsuit that was just filed against and passed against the Fearless Fund, three wonderful women who just wanted to give away $20,000 grants to Black women entrepreneurs, just lost their company, and it was found to be unconstitutional because to give $20,000 grants to Black women is to discriminate against everyone who isn't one. Even though when we look at the data, 0.01% of all global venture capital dollars are put with Black women entrepreneurs. 99.99% of all dollars are not spent with them. And somehow, doing more to move from 0.01% to 0.02% is racism. Why? Because we don't have a heart to heal one another. We don't have a heart to heal one another. We don't believe that there's enough for us. We don't believe the pie is big enough. We don't believe that life is big enough to give a little bit for us. You know, the strange thing about charity and the strange thing about equity and the strange thing about creating a heart for all of this is that you have to have an incredibly powerful sense of reflection in order to be honest about this work. You have to be courageously committed to self-reflection and not believe that you should be ashamed of what you're doing. You should be inspired to do better. That the moment you realize that perhaps you weren't doing it right, you don't immediately assume that you're wrong. You assume that the strategy's wrong. And that practice of reflection will put you at a mirror that will transform the way you live your very life. Let me give you an example. We're in downtown Chicago at the Sears Tower. If you don't understand the claps, you're not from Chicago. We are here in Chicago at the Sears Tower. Yes, yes, yes. If you walk outside on any of these four corners, you are likely to see a person panhandling, a person asking for dollars. Quarter here, $1 there, $5 maybe. They may even be connected to a nonprofit program like Streetwise. They may be selling a newspaper, saying, hey, I'm not looking for a handout, I'm looking for a hand up. It's $3 to get a Streetwise newspaper. I'd love for you to read about some of the stories of people in our program. And I hope you all are supporting Streetwise. I hope you're supporting these folks. Why do we have panhandlers? I'm not asking, do we have people who are on the street, living on the street, who need some help? I'm not asking, do we have them? Why? Why? In order to look at pain and walk away, I believe there has to be something in our minds that says that pain is tolerable. There has to be something tolerable about inequity to allow for its conditions to persist. There has to be something tolerable. Otherwise, why would we commit to it? But I don't know that everyone knows that we're committed to it. You commit to things deliberately or indeliberately. What you allow to fester is still a choice. And we walk on. Now, I'm not blaming anybody for walking on. I walk on too. I walk on sometimes. But I think about this question with some folks. Is the reason why we have homelessness in America and housing insecurity in America and hunger in America and a lack of literacy in America and a lack of anything? Is there a reason in the richest country with some of the brightest individuals and the most powerful companies and the largest areas and spaces and communities of wealth? Is the reason why perhaps because we think somewhere, somehow, if we made certain choices, we deserve that too? When you start to study the social sciences, you realize that all things are not tragedy. Tragedy is an act of God. Tragedy, a hurricane, something like that. Well, with climate change, they may not just be tragic anymore either. But things that are non-tragic have some intentionality behind them. And as someone who's studied social sciences, I know that we design our cities. We don't just create cities, we design them. We design them. There's intentionality. You have to go get licenses, just like with insurance. You have to know what you're doing. And you have to make choices about what you're doing. And if the choices create these sorts of outcomes, then we have to ask ourselves, why do we make those choices? Why do we create a system and a societal model that presupposes the need for charity, rather than presupposes the responsibility of equity? Why do we maintain it? Why do we manage it? And I think somewhere in that, when we think about this question of the other, the person in need, the young person who's an orphan, a man on the street panhandling for $1, a woman trying to find housing for her and her daughter as they've been kicked out and evicted from their homes. Something, I think, for some folks, it's that if you make those choices, that's on you. And if you don't get out of those choices, if you don't get out of that situation, it's on you. And if I had made those choices, it's on me. And if I don't rise up out of that situation, that's on me. Now, in all of that, there's one word that comes to my mind, and that word is compassion. Compassion. Where's the compassion in that? We can be deliberate about planning, but when it comes to tragedy, when we know that 40% of all persons in America experiencing housing insecurity right now have housing insecure situations because of healthcare issues. Healthcare issues. If we know that the largest mental health facility in Cook County is the Cook County Jail right now, they are the largest provider of services for mental health, like people experiencing mental illnesses. There's something here that charity won't fix. There's something here that philanthropy can't touch. There's something here that DEI isn't able to measure. There's a human factor here that is more about, I think, courage and compassion, individual agency and opportunity that can start to fix and change some of these things. That has nothing to do with the company DEI strategy, y'all. That has nothing to do with the company DEI strategy. That has to do with how we live our lives when we leave work. My hope for you all today is that you're not going to be accelerated or inspired to go back to work and do DEI differently. I hope that you go home and live differently. I hope that you see that if it is to be, it's up to me, is not just a nice little rhyming mantra. It's a way of life. I hope that when you walk outside and you see people experiencing housing insecurity, if you choose to give, give. If you choose not to, then please don't feel shame. But understand that we designed for that. We designed for that. It's not just tragedy. Then when we talk about young people who need high quality food in neighborhoods like North Lawndale that are not seen as just food deserts, they're food swamps. The grocery store is the gas station in my neighborhood. When Lay's went up in chip prices from $4 for $1 to $3 for $1, it mattered to a lot of people. When I grew up and we had quarter water, some of y'all know what that is, quarter water and quarter juices, and now Fagos are $1.19, that matters for some people. That was the grocery store called the Amico. But we tolerate and maintain a model where in Lawndale you'll have gas stations as grocery stores, but in Lincoln Park you'll have a Mariano's. And we maintain and manage that system. And when we go home from our DEI conversations, we go home to these different experiences. And then when we come back to work, those experiences come into the workplace. Those who lack and those who didn't come back to work together as employees when they would never be neighbors. The experiences that would create the experiences of proximity that would create the empathy, that would change the minds of people who learned that the cost of their learning should never be the cost of another person's life. They don't learn those things because they're not close enough. They're not close enough. When we don't understand things, friends, we don't need to get louder about them. We need to get closer. We need to get closer. We need to understand how we live together. The work of DEI and the work of my life is not to create just better companies, as I said. It's to create what business should have been in the first place if people mattered. I have no desire to create more opportunities for escalating women in the workplace or more black folks in higher level jobs and these sorts of things if we're not talking about changing the material conditions of our world versus the individual circumstances of a person. The individual opportunities don't often translate to the law. There's no such thing as trickle-down justice. We either have a justice system or we don't. There's no such thing as trickle-down housing. We either have a real housing strategy or we don't. In my family, I'm one of the fortunate ones. I know even standing here today is an incredible privilege that many of my family members don't have. And they trust me to come up here and tell the truth. They trust me to do it. And a lot of you all go into the workplace and you join your DEI committees and you join the corporate giving team and you show up to these events. And someone somewhere trusts you to say they exist, to say their life matters, to say what the real thing is. They don't want you to come up and do a TED talk. They want you to do some real talk. They don't want you to talk about data. They want you to understand that people are the data. They don't want you to talk about how we can increase, top line compensation for folks who are already well above area median income. They wanted you to come in and talk about how we're going to raise the floor, not the ceiling. They don't just want you to do it. They need you to do it. When we look at the condition of our country right now, and we look at the climate of our political atmosphere, I just want to say, I'm curious about why we're not more energetic about being together more. We're not doing well at integration. The problem with diversity is it creates chaos. Diversity creates complexity. Diversity requires that you be intersectional. Diversity requires that when you look at me and hear my voice and hear all the stories I've told, that you don't think that that's representative of black people. I don't have the story of a person from the African continent whose parents just immigrated here. I don't have that story. So you're going to have to look at black and understand it's not a monolith. We hear stories of people of Mexican descent. You can't assume that that represents all of Latinidad. You have to understand that there are a lot of countries in Latin America, and they are very distinct. And you know what that's going to require of you? To be more complex. It's not going to require you to feel ashamed. It's not going to require you to be silenced. It's going to require you to feel more complex. The modern workplace requires that we understand that everyone has a voice, everyone has a part to play. But we have to know how to moderate these conversations such that they lead to action together rather than division together. And we're not doing well at it. The reason why it's hard to sometimes motivate people to come to DEI conversations. It's hard to motivate them to come and give back. It's hard to motivate them to think about how there's enough for everybody. It's because we haven't made the value proposition clear on any of those things. What is the value of diversity? It's not just because you can make more money and get more innovations because you're diverse. We're safer when we're better together. We're literally safer. James Baldwin once said, James Baldwin is a historian, an artist, and a civil rights leader. He said, one thing that people have to remember is if I'm hungry, you're not safe. We both need to eat. One of the hardest things about coming into workplaces and having these types of conversations and advancing intersectional strategies that replicate the value of DEI is that sometimes you'll be working with people you don't agree with. Sometimes you'll be working with people you think are problematic. And the reality is we still need to know how to work with them. One of the strangest things that people know that they learn about me is I was one of those folks out here in 2014 when Ferguson happened. And I started using words. I was leading the social innovation strategy at the University of Chicago. And unfortunately, I started using some phrases that I think were a little political at the time. I started saying things like Black Lives Matter. And it was really setting off some fireworks. And people were like, a little too far there. Right? Not because they didn't agree, because they felt it was too political. Right? They said, yes, Black Lives Matter, but you don't have to say that. And I was saying, but I am Black. And my life does matter. And allyship is not whether you agree with me. It's about whether you'll say what I say, how I say it, because it's about me. And that's a risk for you. But the nature of the strength of our relationships between each other is not based on our levels of agreement. It's based on whether, regardless of whether we agree or not, we believe and will fight for the right for another to exist and have the opportunities that we have. And even if I don't agree with what you're saying, I fight for your right to live. When I started talking about police reform and bringing that into DEI conversations, it became a real issue, y'all. When I started to even go further and say, hey, I'm one of those police abolitionists, and people's eyebrows went way up, and maybe in here, you're going way up. My brother's superintendent of police. I have to be able to hold a love for police as I am speaking about the realities of systemic harm that an institution specifically perpetuates on people of color, and still hold the love. And still hold the love and never let it go. And fight for a way to talk about this in a way that honors my family, honors the sacrifices, honors the contributions, and also acknowledges where it still may be harmful. We have to grow to understand that our responsibility is to hold the inherent tension of our differences. That's the work. We're different. Like I said, diversity creates what? Chaos. Because it creates complexity. It requires us to be more emotionally managed. It requires us to be psychologically ready for difference. It requires us to be intellectually competent and to be humble throughout all of it. It requires us not to fight just for strategy, but to fight for love. To know that our partners aren't always the people who are going to agree fully with us, but it's the people who will fight completely for us. That's our work. That's our work. I don't know what y'all talk about at DEI committee meetings, but that's what I'll be talking about. The reality is we have so much work to do. We have so much love to create. We have so much business to do. We have so much more growth that we need to experience, but we need to engage the ideas of compassion and courage and love and shared risk before we can do any of that. We need to understand that it's not just important to be strategic, it's vital that we be impactful, that we not just measure activities, that we measure outcomes, that we not get fragile and ashamed of the fact that we're not producing a desired outcome, but get inspired and start moving with some real acceleration to change our strategy to achieve our desired impacts. It means that we can't allow for the conversation of social change to move at the pace of those who are most fragile about it. We have to move at the pace of those who are most ambitious for it. We can't let fear drive this. We have to let ambition drive it. We can't be afraid of disappointing people. We need to be excited about saving people. We can't focus just on what we're giving. We have to focus on what created the need to give it. We have to understand that we all have to do this together. Some of the hardest conversations we're going to have in the future, in the next several years, are bringing more people into this work. And to do that, the people who hold minoritized identities, like myself, need some more humility. One of the most challenging and I think disorienting things that I often say to my black and brown friends is like, you got to at some point understand that white folks get to talk too. Whew, that can get some people upset. That can get some people upset. They're people. They're people too. They got stake. Not literally. But they have a stake in this. And what do you think is going to happen if we achieve a more equitable world? Do you think people just disappear? You're going to have to prepare your heart to welcome more people into community that you felt weren't here for you. And you don't start that work of preparing for people after they've already come in. You prepare your heart for them before they're there. That's the nature of belonging. That's the challenge with a lot of workplaces. They want to recruit people in before they prepare their own house to hold them. And the same is true for us as individuals. The reality of this is the work of women, to prepare the heart for these toxic, terrible men to come into a benevolent community where we have shared values and we understand accountability and mutual prosperity. It's all of our work. Our work starts where our privilege starts, but our compassion is required where our hurts are evident. We have to move with grace, authenticity, honor, integrity. We need these words to become the fabric of diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as charity and philanthropy. We need to understand the opportunity and not be ashamed of the lack of traction. We need to be upset at a lack of traction. We need to know that the work starts with us. It doesn't start in the workplace. This is our work, y'all. Activities are not strategies, and strategies are not impact. I'm here for the latter. What are you here for? Thank you. Thank you. No. We're going to do some Q&A. First, I want y'all to breathe again. Breathe again. Breathe again. Breathe again. Breathe again. This is the I know some of y'all are cold. I'm cold. My fingers are cold. There's a whole lot of data on the sexism and gender issues around the temperature in offices. Some of y'all may not have. Some of y'all may have read the literature. But we've got time for some Q&A. So I just want to say one thing. I know sometimes speakers will say like, hey, there's some things don't talk to. We don't want to talk about this or don't talk about that. I deliberately gave y'all a couple of edgier points, because I wanted you all to understand that the role of leadership is to demonstrate the competency, the capacity, and the confidence to say what is true. There's no question you can ask me that's off limits. There's no question that's too personal. Whether you want to be tactical, practical, or theoretical, we good up here. All right? I prepare myself to be able to help anything and anyone. And that's also what the nature of Justice Informed is, to be just ready, to not be prescriptive, to just be ready for the future and ready for what you all have. So any questions? Yes, hello. Oh, people power is always more powerful. The reason you can only You can only check a corporation if you go together. It's a simple phrase. The lonely antelope on the savannah gets eaten. Many of you all may have unsuccessful DEI strategies. You may be trying to push for certain new types of activities or initiatives in your workplace, and you feel like you're getting shot down. And partly the reason for that is because you may be going alone or you may not be going with enough people. You have to demonstrate that there is a standard experience versus an exceptional experience in the workplace to counter the types of power that even one leader may have. When we talk about the public space and corporations, I think corporations, I think it's going to be really interesting what happens with companies in the next several years. One, because the corporations are citizens argument has really pushed, I think, a lot of this challenge that we're now facing. I was talking about around corporations also now being the face of social change. If you look at the recent data in the Ipsos polls last year, if you look at religious institutions, universities, corporations, and government officials, the most trusted is corporations. Yes, corporate leaders are the most trusted. In the most recent, I couldn't believe it either. Now, at the same time, they don't trust religion. They don't trust government. People don't trust the nonprofit folks. I'm just saying, if that's where we're at, right, if people are trusting the corporations, then they're also looking at the question of corporate voice and personality. But corporate voice and personality, when you're talking about 20,000 people in a company, how do you create a singular voice? How do you sort of legislate what our position on something is? And we've seen over the last several months, and really the last 4 years, as companies get more involved in speaking up and speaking out, that they're realizing that they don't have the skills for that. They don't have the skills for that. And partly is because of what they're trying to maintain, that while at the same time not let go of something else. You cannot hold on to looking to be virtuous while holding on to the things that create the need for virtue. You can't hold both of those things. That's why the first thing I wanted to talk to y'all about were about the fact that you can't hold on to everything. You have to let something go. You have to let something go. You know, we have to start choosing. And I think a lot of corporations have challenges in choosing, partly because of how they're set up. I'll say, as someone who goes in and does auditing of corporations and I have to work with a lot of GCs and such, I also have sympathy. Increasingly, I have sympathy for many corporations. And that's partly because of the ways that litigation works and legislation works. We're working right now with the Advancing Equity and Banking Commission. It's just a sort of a snapshot. Many banks throughout Northern Illinois are interested in the work of racial equity. In 2020, many of them made pledges. You all may recall this. Many banks made pledges towards racial equity, diversity, hiring, these sorts of things. And the Chicago Treasurer's Office and the Illinois State Treasurer came together and said in 2020, we want to be able to encourage but also hold accountable banks towards these pledges and to encourage them to do more, but also to be able to meaningfully track what they are doing relative to DEI and mortgage lending and their small business investments and these sorts of things. But at the same time, all of these banks have different strategies. They all have different, you ask one person, what is racial equity? You ask another person, what is racial equity? They may have two totally different experiences, very different definitions. And you're trying to align those things to create collective impact. Well, that's very challenging. Different size banks, just like insurance companies, you all may have different regulatory requirements. The ways in which you're set up may create a different regulatory requirement. And those things are part of the inputs to what your potential strategy could be that I think many in the public, they just aren't aware of. Sort of those strings that bind people from doing more meaningful work. We want more banks to work together, right? On racial equity. We want them to be able to pool resources. We also have antitrust and anti-collusion legislation. We don't want banks working together on everything. We don't want them colluding on everything, but we didn't perhaps write the legislation with the assumption that the social activities would be limited because of the financial activities we did want to limit. And we would have to change the law in order to create a permission for these types of institutions to start to advance certain types of work. That's a challenge. That's a challenge. What can we do in the face of that? People would need to start talking, because where does that change need to happen? In the legislation work. And who affects legislation? Voters. People would need to come together and say, this is a problem. People power. That's why my first answer is just people power. People coming together is how you confront a large institution. The only thing that can overthrow a king is the people saying, we don't want you anymore. People got to come together. And that's why my entire talk today was about unity and the question of how we come together. When I said, we're not doing great at integration, not even like belonging, just integration. right? We're not even great at it. Like, we have to be able to come together in order to create the types of changes we want. The answer is come together. Yes?
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm feeling like I look. How I look? I'm a Leo. Sorry, y'all. Yeah, I want to speak to that. That last point, you have to tie it to the dollar. I agree, you do. I just want to say, what Martin Luther King was fighting for is the minimum of what I think we should be doing. What was absolutely considered radical, transformative, and vital 50, 60 years ago is now the starting line for a conversation versus something radical. This is the power of time. The same is true when we talk about specialization in business. You get your edge, your competitive edge, and it's really special, and then what happens? You lose your patent law, now everybody's in. They all got it. And now it's not special anymore, it's just general. The same is true for social progress. There used to be a time when we would talk about tolerance. We would have programs called teaching tolerance. Some of you all may actually know about those programs. We would say the goal is to tolerate people in the workplace. I think that's a terrible selling line. My goal is to tolerate women. Right? We laugh about it now. It was radical at one point to consider tolerance when just years before we had systemically maintained segregation. We have been talking about diversity, and I would say that for the old, I'm called an elder millennial by the Gen Zers. For the elder millennials all the way down and the Gen Zers, the idea of diversity is a starting line. It's not really a conversation. It's not a conversation point with us. Of course you should have diversity, not how do we have diversity. Of course. Why wouldn't you? The business case doesn't really work that well with us because we don't think that the point of diversity or the point of business is just profit. The first thing I said was, my goal is not to have 1,000 clients. It's to have 10 good models of what business should have been in the first place. What it should have been in the first place. My goal is not to rewrite or to create a new country of democracy and all that. My goal is to create what we should have had in a constitution in the first place. Now, we didn't have it, and we can do better. But the reality is, if we have the opportunity to do it and really start, why would we start with what we've already said is past tense? I agree that to negotiate with and persuade business leaders, you have to talk about the question of how does this impact the bottom line? How do we make more money doing this? How do we engage the levers of either saving money or making money in this strategy? Absolutely. I think that is an increasingly dying value proposition for people, not for business, for people. I think that that's on the way out. Secondly, that value proposition, when it comes to equity, when I start talking about like my family and the people back home, there's a lot of women, people of color, queer folks, there's a lot of diversity in this room. There's people who need to be sitting next to you who are just like you. And you're going to have to do something more ambitious than just talk about how much money a company can make off of them to get them in. There's going to have to be a human value proposition. There's going to have to be an equitable value proposition. There's going to have to be more than a business case. There's going to have to be the case of this should have been done in the first place. And that, as a driving value proposition, particularly for younger employees, that's what gets them in. That's what keeps them. Right now, my generation is the largest generation in the workforce. This is why I said I think this is on the way out. Gen Z, is currently I believe the second largest generation in the workforce in the next 5 years. I'm not saying that you don't have them at hello when you show up and show a wallet. What I'm saying is that we are going to have to look to people to define the work and define our articulation of the value of the work sooner than we think. And I think that's a good thing.